to get started, I'd like to see by a show of hands, how many folks in here have a herd that you're dealing with that has PED or has had PED over the last year? Okay, so a little less than 50%. And that's about what we think the incidence probably is in that close to 50% range now. So that kind of reaffirms that. So what I thought I'd do is go through some of the background of how we got to where we are today, and then I think Liz is going to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from all of that. So basically, it looks like TGE, acts a little bit like TGE, but it certainly is not TGE. If we look at how this all arose, and I want to thank Dr. Matt Ackerman for some of these slides. Matt's a veterinarian in Indiana who was one of the first veterinarians to see this disease and did a really excellent job, I think, on getting people involved and reporting the disease and moving us forward to the point we are today. So just want to give him some recognition for that. But back on May 5th, he received the first phone call that the farm thought they had a disease. They thought they had TGE and wanted him to come out and look at that, which he did on Monday. They submitted samples to the lab. Those initial samples came back on the 8th as PCR negative for TGE, which was interesting. And Matt called the veterinary diagnostic lab and asked, "Are you sure your test is working right? This looks like TGE. I've got another herd now that's breaking very similar sorts of clinical signs." And that sort of started the ball rolling to getting the laboratory digging in a little further with this. And on the 10th of May, they did an electron microscopy that showed up positive for coronaviruses. So that now we've got this information that says it's negative for TGE, but it's a coronavirus, so what is it? So they sent samples over to the National Veterinary Services Laboratory. On the 16th of May, they confirmed that it was porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, and on the 17th, USDA announced that, in fact, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus had entered the U.S. So at that point, it's a new introduction. As far as we know, there had never been PED in North America prior to this. So what did we know? A lot of people ask, well, if we had at that time stopped all movements from those farms that we knew or suspected were positive for PED, could we have stopped or influenced the future spread of this virus? And I think that's really highly unlikely. And to sort of reinforce that, this is what we knew on the 17th of May when the USDA announced that we had the virus. We knew there were 4 cases. There were 3 in Iowa and 1 in Indiana. There were also a couple of other cases in a couple of other states that were suspected but had not yet been confirmed. So when we actually went back and Iowa State and the other diagnostic labs had a chance to look at samples that they had in their freezer with a similar clinical presentation, what we actually now know is that there were at least 31 actual cases, farms that were infected on the 18th of May, which is the day after USDA announced. So even if we had done something with those 4 initial farms that we knew about, the disease was already fairly widespread and in a number of different states at that point. So by the 20th of May, we actually had a total of 74 cases that we knew about. So again, just within a couple of days, now that the diagnostic labs have had an opportunity to get the diagnostics up and going and learn about this, there were already over 70 some cases that were out there. So the clinical signs, clinically, it's indistinguishable from TGE, other than perhaps the level of mortality that we see on some farms. It's an alpha coronavirus. You heard earlier Lisa talk about a delta coronavirus that's also been introduced. Those are 2 different viruses. And we also have a second, at least one other alpha coronavirus that we know that's been introduced as well. It's a fecal oral pathogen. We get a very profuse diarrhea and vomiting and very high mortality rates in very young pigs. Suckling pigs 1 to 3 weeks of age, you can see as high as 100% mortality in those pigs. As the pigs age, you get still a high morbidity, but a much lower level of mortality. The key point to keep in mind is that it's not a zoonotic disease, which means it does not infect humans, and it's not a food safety concern, so pork is safe to eat. Diagnostics, PCR was ready very quickly. I'll give the veterinary diagnostic labs high marks for their response to the introduction of this disease. They got a PCR up and running very quickly. The PCR is good in that it's very sensitive. It allows us to detect the presence of the viral or viral particles in a sample. The downside of the PCR is that it can't tell you whether those particles are actually still viable or not. It can't tell you whether the virus that they're detecting in that sample can still infect a naive pig or not, and that makes it much more difficult for us on a control standpoint when you've got a sample that you know is PCR positive, but you've got to actually put that sample into a live pig to determine whether or not it can cause disease. That's a very insensitive method of determining whether or not a virus or a viral particle is viable. As you heard Lisa talk about earlier, it's a very difficult virus to grow. That also causes us some problems when we start looking at development of vaccines and those kinds of things. So a couple of pictures again. Matt Ackerman provided these shots for me, so I appreciate that. Just a lot of what you see is a lot of huddling and piling of pigs, a lot of dead pigs, obviously, and that's a sign that nobody wants to see on any day of the week when they walk into the farrowing house. So Matt put together this chart that looked at the percent survivability out to day 7. And as you can see in this chart, what he shows is weeks 1 and 2, basically you've got 0% livability. 100% of the pigs in the farrowing house typically die. And then gradually over time, as herd immunity builds up, we tend to see this type of picture where you get increasing levels of survivability as the weeks go on. So again, as we said, the PED virus is new to North America. There is some evidence it was in Europe in the 70s and currently present in certain areas of Southeast Asia. The U.S. virus was 99+% similar to a 2012 isolate from Anhui province in China. So our suspicion is that this virus originated in that area of China and somehow made its way into the U.S. And that's the question that we still need an answer to, is how that virus made it to the U.S. live in high enough amounts to get on multiple farms at roughly the same time and infect pigs on those farms. Of course, at that time, the U.S. swine herd was 100% susceptible. There was no vaccine available at that time, and it's a very easily transmitted virus. So the response in the early days was USDA took a look at the virus, determined first and foremost that it was not a foreign animal disease. So there's a specific list of diseases that the World Organization for Animal Health maintains that are specifically noted as foreign animal diseases. This disease was not on that list, even though it is quote-unquote foreign to the U.S. at that time. So USDA designated PED as a transboundary disease. It was not reportable, not regulatory. Therefore, it was basically a production disease like PRRS has been or PCV has been in the past. And therefore, basically, the response turned over to the swine industry to deal with that virus as they had with others. So the Port Board, MPPC, and American Association of Swine Veterinarians all got together and attempted to coordinate an effort with USDA to understand what the epidemiology of the virus is and to develop a strategy for response. Of course, it became evident very early on that it is a disease that is transmitted very easily through contaminated manure and anything that manure may find itself on. So the first thing that the groups did was concentrated on elevating biosecurity, trying to prevent contamination of your farm if the virus had not already made its way there. So Lisa talked a little bit about this as well. There was collaboration with a number of groups at trying to formulate outreach efforts to swine producers, veterinarians, and other groups on ways that we might be able to prevent introduction of this disease into naive herds. So there's been a lot of efforts going on behind the scenes at trying to find ways to prevent introduction and then share that information widely with the industry. But early on, as I said before, the main concern is how did this virus get into the U.S.? And certainly from a veterinary standpoint, that's the first thing that we wanted to know. And so the AASV, in collaboration, again, with the industry, as well as the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health at USDA, put together a survey that we administered to the initial cases of virus that were found in the U.S. And again, the purpose of this was not to determine how the virus was moving within the U.S. The purpose was to try to find maybe what was that window that was open that allowed this virus to get into the U.S. in the first place. So AASV, through our veterinarians, administered that survey to these initial case herd practitioners. The data was then transferred to the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health, who did the analysis there at SIA. The questionnaire itself examined over 100 different potential variables or different routes that this virus may have entered into the U.S. There were approximately 25 case herds or herds that were positive early on, and we tried to match those up with 18 additional herds that were negative at that time. And those herds what we asked for were herds that were basically matched, that were very similar to an infected herd. If you had another herd that was similar to that was negative, we asked you information about that. And Dr. Wagstrom from MPPC spent, a month in our office or so helping with this survey and doing some of the analysis and putting all this information together. So what we found out of looking at those 100-plus variables was that basically there were only 7 out of that 100-plus that were considered significantly likely to have had some association with the introduction of this virus into the U.S. Those 7 risk factors were actually associated with the process of feeding the animals. Now, having said that, it wasn't targeting a specific feed or a specific ingredient or a specific manufacturer, but in general, those 7 variables had some association with the act of feeding the animals. So I know you can't read this chart, but this is just sort of outlining what those 7 variables were and what the odds ratios were that we found in that study. And again, you can see, odds ratios of ranging from a 0.44 all the way up to a 3.5, which would mean that, if you fall in that category, then you had a 3.5 times the likelihood of getting infected than if you didn't have that category. So again, as part of the response, we developed 3 working groups to look at the various aspects of transmission of the disease. The first was on biocontainment, which is trying to find ways to limit the spread of the virus off of an infected premise. If you're already infected, how do we keep the virus from spreading to your neighbors? And that's a little bit in contrast to biosecurity, where you're trying to put things in place on your farm to keep the virus from coming in. And the third working group was looking at packing plants. And Lisa talked earlier about some of the information that we had gained from looking at environmental samples taken at the packing plants. Lisa talked about the research, and this is definitely an older slide. This was early on. The Port Board put $800,000 immediately into doing research on this. She talked about the shortened time frame that we asked researchers to comply with, and looking at some really very early basic aspects of this virus in an effort to try to learn as quickly as we could things about the diagnostics and the pathogenesis and the environmental stability and epidemiology and all those kinds of things. She mentioned briefly a study that all of us funded by Dr. Jim Lowe that looked at transmission in the packing plant lairage. Basically what he found was that trailers actually do become contaminated at the lairage, at the packing plants, due to movement of animals, drivers, people working within the packing plant, those kinds of things. The more contact that occurs, obviously the higher rate of contamination you get. And this is the results of Jim's study. Basically what he found was that one positive contaminated trailer coming into a packing plant means that there's 1.7 or almost 2 positive trailers that leave the packing plant. So basically you get 1 trailer comes in positive, 2 trailers go out positive. She also mentioned some work that Dr. Matthew Turner did at the coal buying stations in North Carolina. At that time, North Carolina did not have clinical disease in the state, but Matthew was wondering, is it here? Where would I go looking for it if I wanted to find it? And he went to the four coal buying stations there. What he found was that the people at the buying stations were very, very cooperative and eager to work with the industry to do anything they could to try to prevent the spread of this virus and to learn more about whether or not they already had the virus. And what he found was that really there was pretty minimal biosecurity in place, and he was able to detect the virus, I believe, at all four of those buying stations. And so it's very likely that transmission was occurring as people moved in and out of those buying stations. So funding, Lisa's already talked about this. I won't delve into the funding for research, but other than to say there has been very significant dollars coming out of the industry to try to address this from a research standpoint. We're somewhere in excess of $3 million now, Lisa, I think, from producer dollars that are actually trying to look at the research that we need to address this disease. So feed is a possible vector. That's one we've all heard of. The AASV survey, as I mentioned, did indicate that feed was likely associated with the introduction. We've had a number of cases where feed has anecdotally been associated with it, where you have animals that are moved, clean animals that are moved into a clean facility. They start a new feed regimen and turn positive 2 or 3 days later. We've heard those kind of anecdotal things. Unfortunately, we've been unable to actually prove that, in part because of the difficulty with this bioassay that we talked about earlier. It's a very insensitive process to determine viability of a virus. But we're getting PCR positives out of a number of different feed and feed-related sort of samples. This talks about some of that feed testing. Again, I won't go through it. Basically, what it says is that we've taken a number of feed samples, found those samples or the ingredients to be PCR positive, have then put those back into pigs and not been able to reproduce the disease in most cases. Now, Canada had a little more success with a plasma protein that they had that they were able to reproduce. But again, they couldn't take the finished feed sample and reproduce disease in the pigs either at that point. Again, a little more information on feed as a possible vector. Dr. Scott D. has done some work that looked at feeding PED virus positive feed to pigs that have actually seroconverted. So some of that work that he's done, I think, proves that it is theoretically possible that if you had a live virus in a feed sample at a high enough level that you could infect pigs if you follow them out far enough and test enough pigs. So one thing that we've just started looking at is, and Lisa talked a little bit about this, was we're starting to see these rebreaks in herds, and it looks like from the numbers we can gather, approximately 30% of the herds see some form of a rebreak later down the line. Some of that is introduction of a different virus. Some of it's introduction of the same virus. And there's lots of reasons for that. Is it a different virus, or do we have so much virus present that we're just overriding the level of immunity in those herds? Those are the kinds of questions that the research that Lisa's group is funding is looking at. But one thing that we tried to do was do a feedback survey from veterinarians that had tried to do feedback. As most of you know, on TGE basis, feedback's fairly common and works pretty well. What we're seeing in PED is that it's less successful. We had approximately 83 herds that responded to the survey. Basically, there was a 50-50 success or failure rate with that. So we had a small number of samples to look at, so there's really no statistics that you can put to it. And we're still sort of working through all of this information. But a couple of things that sort of came out early on to this is that if you look at the frequency of days to first feedback, in other words, after they noted clinical signs, how soon would they begin feedback? In most cases, it's 1 or 2 days post-clinical signs. That was fairly common. If you look at the success of that by day started, It certainly appears, at least, that the earlier you can get that started, the more likely you are to have some success in developing some lasting herd immunity by doing that. The percentage of herds that had PED post-feedback by week, again, in most cases we see herd immunity develop, but the question is how long does it last? And in a lot of the cases that had a post-feedback rebreak, somewhere between 4 to 6 or greater than 6 weeks after feedback is when they would start seeing that rebreak occur. One of the things, and this is on a very, very small number of the subset of population that we were able to look at, so I don't know that there's really what to say about this other than it was an interesting scratch your head. But when we looked at a few of these herds had actually done some serology testing, some IFA and ELISA positives, and when we looked at comparing the percentage of sows with diarrhea or off feed and whether or not feedback had been successful in that herd, one of the interesting things we found was that in a number of the cases that actually feedback succeeded, we actually saw very low or relatively low response in the sows when they fed back. In other words, when you feed back to the sows, you usually see clinical signs associated with that within the sows. And what we saw in these cases was that, like in the first one on the yellow there, you saw only 65% of the herds exhibited diarrhea, but yet they had not seen a recurrence of the disease in the pigs. You see some down here where there were 30% that saw some clinical signs in the sows, but yet didn't see any rebreak in the pigs after that. So it's just an interesting finding, something we need to look into a little further as part of the control mechanisms. Educational outreach, Lisa talked a lot about this. There's a lot of information out there on the internet on both AASV and the pork.org websites. You're welcome to go to those websites and dig through that information. She talked about a lot of the guidelines that we've all jointly worked on to put these together, addressing things like biosecurity and biocontainment. There's a lot of that information there, and I encourage you to go look some of this stuff up because there's some very good pamphlets and things that you can print off from the website that really talk in depth about how you need to handle manure and trailers and things like that are potential vectors for spread of this disease. So this slide's a little bit dated. I actually looked the numbers up this morning before I came down, but currently as of this morning, we had 7,111 positive accessions and a little over 20,000 total accessions that have been submitted. So basically that's given us about a little over a third of all of the accessions that are being submitted are actually positive for PED. And the number of states that are now positive is 30. And again, that information is published every week on our website, so feel free to go to aasv.org and look at that. It just shows the states where the disease is positive. Looking at the number of new cases by week, as you can see during the colder winter months is when we reached our peak. That decline that you see on the right-hand side is continuing to decline. We hope that continues to show that trend and move towards zero. It'll be interesting to see through this summer, if we fall back to the levels we were seeing before. Hopefully we'll get lower than that, but we'll really need to wait through next winter to see what the overall effects of the virus are going to be, I think. A little bit about the Canadian experience. They confirmed their first case in Ontario in January 23rd of this year. CFIA announced that they had the positive feed that I mentioned to you earlier. The virus has since spread to multiple farms in Ontario, and as far as I know, there's still only one each in Quebec, Manitoba, and Prince Edward Island. There may have been a second one, I think, in Manitoba possibly. But so what we've learned, although this virus is similar to TGE, it is definitely a different bug. It's more active in the winter in the warmer environments than we would expect TGE to be. It's more difficult to control in a sow herd. The clinical picture can be much more severe. Like I said, up to 100% mortality in very young pigs. We're not seeing any cross protection between TGE or porcine respiratory coronavirus, or even really between the three similar viruses that we've seen with PED. And this virus, pigs produce huge amounts of this virus, so there's lots of virus in the environment. We've obviously got holes in our defense layers. We've got defenses set up at the border for North America, and the virus still got in. There's breaks there somewhere, which we need to figure out how to fill those. But not only there, our biosecurity levels at the farm level were not adequate to keep the virus out either. And even in cases where we have really ramped up the biosecurity, this virus is still finding its way in. So it's a virus that's very easy to move around. I'll say that the veterinary diagnostic labs responded very quickly. There are challenges still today with the ability of the labs to communicate with each other effectively and in a timely manner, and that's something that's going to be critical as we try to control any of these diseases, and particularly if we're talking about a foreign animal disease where you've got lots of labs involved. We need the capability for those labs to be able to communicate effectively and electronically. But they did a great job at stepping up and getting tools in place, and continue to validate those tools and improve the quality of the diagnostics. The use and ability to capture premises ID numbers is critical to understanding the epidemiology of this virus. Most all of y'all's farms out there now have a premises ID number. We need to get to where we're making sure that premise ID number is on the diagnostic submission forms, so that the laboratories can better determine what samples they're looking at, whether or not these are repeat samples from the same farm, if they're from a different farm, try to analyze from an epidemiological standpoint how this virus is moving around. So I would encourage you to work with your veterinarian on ensuring that those premises ID numbers are included on the sample submission forms. Delta coronavirus, Lisa touched on this just real quickly. Clinically looks like PED, but tests negative. There is a differential PCR that's available. Was first seen, as I understand it, in Hong Kong in 2012. It was identified here in Ohio in February, and also in Canada in March. So again, just some quick acknowledgments. Dr. Matt Ackerman, who provided some of these slides, and I think Matt has done an excellent job in keeping us informed on what's going on in the field out there. We've also done a lot of work with the veterinary diagnostic labs, particularly Dr. Roger Main, and then the folks at SIA under the leadership of Brian McCluskey have helped us with some of the survey work. And of course, we worked very closely with Paul, and he gave me some of these slides as well on some of the research funding that they've got available.